We meet today on the unsurrendered traditional and ancestral territories of the Musqueam people. Our university is located on land claimed by the British as a colonial admiralty reserve in the mid-19th century and occupied by UBC since 1914. It is known as Point Grey in English, but these lands, of course, have their own Musqueam names and have been sites of learning for many generations. At the Center for Climate Justice, where I'm a co-director and which is helping to put on this event, we recognize our obligations as teachers, researchers, scholars, and learners in ensuring that our classrooms and our work uphold the best of that long-standing learning context. We also recognize the myriad ways that our disciplines are shaped and challenged by both colonizing violence and decolonial commitment. These complexities continue to impact much of what we do in and beyond the classroom, regardless of our areas of teaching and research focus. Climate justice in this context must take place in the spirit of both repair and deep transformation. That includes attempts to repair the damage done to our collective knowledge by systemic exclusion of Indigenous, Black, and non-European experts and knowledge holders, often compounded by extractive, unaccountable research practices in frontline communities. Today's event will be a dialogue about climate justice that spans oceans and continents, which is fitting. After all, the colonial and capitalist drivers of the climate crisis are transnational and ongoing, here on these lands and in many other lands. And so it must also be said that today, and for the past 5.5 unbearable months, these logics have been unleashed with genocidal fury on Palestinian bodies and lands in Gaza, unleashed by the State of Israel, and with the material and diplomatic backing of every imperial and settler colonial state in the world, including Canada. It is not by accident that nations and peoples who have waged successful, if partial, decolonial struggles from South Africa to Ireland are also the most steadfast in their solidarity with Palestinians as they confront and attempt to survive this genocide. In saying this, I speak for myself, not for our guests, our department, and notably not for our silent university. But I must speak because, like many of my colleagues, I refuse to be part of any institutional practice that makes ritualistic acknowledgement of lands that were stolen in the past without acknowledging our complicity in lands being stolen with blood and fire in the present day. Thank you all for being here. I want to thank my colleagues at UBC Center for Climate Justice who collaborated to make this event happen. Katie McChesney, who did all the organizational heavy lifting with Jack, Jack, I screw this up, Sushadovsky. Kavita Philip, the co-director of CCJ, helped to draft that welcome. And I also want to thank Onyx Sloan Morgan, who first hosted an event that put me in dialogue with Dr. Jeanette Armstrong several months ago at UBC Okanagan. I found Dr. Armstrong's words about the critical role of Indigenous leadership in achieving anything resembling climate justice so challenging and enriching and important that when we went out for pizza afterwards, we decided that we needed to do it all over again at the Vancouver campus. And so we are here. Then, as it happened, we learned that another hugely influential leader in this field, Dr. Christine Winter, was going to be traveling from New Zealand to Vancouver to participate in a major conference that's happening here this week. And I want to thank my colleague, Jessica Dempsey, for that hot tip. So then another idea was born, which was putting these two amazing scholars and humans in conversation with one another to see what would emerge. And so that is the idea for today. We're going to have 2 short presentations from our esteemed guests, and then a conversation between Drs. Armstrong and Winter, which I'll facilitate, and then we'll have a little bit of time for your questions. So I'm going to do some inadequate introductions to let you know who we're going to be hearing from. Sorry, this mic is very sensitive. Dr. Jeanette Armstrong is Syilx Okanagan, a fluent speaker and teacher of the Insilchen Okanagan language and a traditional knowledge keeper of the Okanagan Nation. She is founder of Inalkin, a profoundly important language and knowledge institution of higher learning of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. Her contributions to language revitalization are incalculable, and I cannot overstate how beloved Dr. Armstrong is by generations of students for whom she has helped reconnect to language, culture, and tradition. She currently is Associate Professor and Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Okanagan Philosophy at UBC Okanagan. She has a PhD in Environmental Ethics and Syilx Indigenous Languages. She is the recipient of the Eco Trust Buffett Award for Indigenous Leadership, and in 2016, the BC George Woodcock Lifetime Achievement Award. As an author, she has published works of poetry, prose, children's literature, and of course, her academic writing. Dr. Armstrong, we are so honored to have you as a colleague. Thank you for making the trip from your homelands to be with us. We are equally honored to be joined today by Dr. Christine Winter, who comes via a much longer journey from New Zealand. Dr. Winter is a senior lecturer in environmental, climate change, multi-species, and Indigenous politics at the University of Otago. Her research focuses on the ways European political theory, and particularly its theories of justice, continue to perpetuate injustice or perpetrate injustice on many peoples, and more specifically on Maori people, as well as non-human species and other living parts of our world. She is the author of the 2022 book, The Subjects of Intergenerational Justice, Indigenous Philosophy, the Environment, and Relationships, which offers a powerful decolonial critique of intergenerational justice. Her current work is highly relevant to the global debates and understandings of land back, and she has a revelatory perspective on why we should not fear land back, but embrace it as the cosmological and epistemic shift required to meet our moment of overlapping and intersecting crises. So Dr. Winter and Armstrong, welcome. And I'm going to hand it over. Thank you. Dr. Armstrong, we will start with you at the podium to share some thoughts on Syilx-led climate justice.
I'm just going to give you greetings in my Salish language, my Syilxian language, and give my acknowledgement in my language to the people from this territory, the Musqueam people. Why Haskalt, Limlim, Kinskitskala, Ulkan Limti Spusa, Tumhula, Tali Hast, Ulkan Jut Limt, Ekel Nimslam people, Musqueam. Item kula kung jak steam match kal swatch jak kailistul kastuil yat steam iltem kula kung ihyat iltem stem today. So I also want to make sure that my greetings are for all of you that are here today and all of those that are listening in the viewing rooms at the Okanagan, my home territory. I want to really thank the Climate Justice Center for Climate Justice for the work that they're doing to bring voice to these concerns that we have as Indigenous peoples. And I was really thankful for all of the help that I got from Katie and in the bringing me here and getting me organized. And I'm so honored to be having a dialogue with Naomi and Christine today, real women of power and work that is so needed today. I just want to also acknowledge and thank our two campuses for continuing to do this kind of bringing of people together in person. And I want to thank the viewing rooms for bringing people there in person as well to be together rather than open online. I think the one at UBCO campus and the one at the Unitarian Church. I think those are going to be filled just as much as this room is filled here. So that tells you about some of the things that people are interested in. So today I'm going to be speaking about shaping justice through an Indigenous knowledge. My focus at the last talk at UBC Okanagan was more about the Syilx people and climate justice, but I really want to broaden that today. Just start with some facts and information that I'll share with you. There was a study that was published that caught my eye in the Canadian Journal of Forest Research that found that roughly 4.1 million people here in Canada, that is 12.3% of the Canadian population, are in dangerous forest interface areas. So that's really huge and significant. And more than 2.7 million hectares of land in Canada have already been affected by wildfires. That's just mind-boggling. As an extreme example, here in BC, the Don Creek fire last year in northeastern BC broke the provincial record as the single largest fire on record. And here in there where I live, not here, but more in the south, south central and southern BC, the unprecedented atmospheric river events of 2021 led to the major flooding and landslides that impacted many, many British Columbians, not only here close to us, but in the interior and everywhere. However, my focus is on Indigenous communities. So those pieces of information are important for everyone to know. So the percentage for for Indigenous people, the percentages that I just mentioned, the 12.3%, is nearly 3 times higher. 32.1% of their entire population of Indigenous peoples in Canada are in forest interface areas and right in the middle of the forests in many cases. So if we think on that for a minute, it gives us some idea of the dangers ahead and the work that must be done to understand that and to know about that in terms of mitigation work that needs to happen. In an Indigenous news report, Tammy Weber and Noah Berger said in last July 2023, after those fires started, that by then 106 wildfires had affected 93 First Nation communities, with 64 full evacuations from those communities involving 25,000 people. So we think about that, it's not in just the removal of the people from those communities, people who have virtually very little in most of those communities, but also the losses that they had to return to. So there was a CBC report during that time in August, I believe, that the land and environment manager for Prophet River First Nation, which is up in more northern Treaty 8 territory in BC, he described the Donnie Creek fire as catastrophic. That's a word, but let's see how he describes it. So he describes it in that the flames destroyed all their trapper cabins, their trap lines, the hunting and fishing areas that they use continually, their burial grounds, many, many archaeological sites where special kinds of burials are done above ground, all their traditional trails, and a rare diamond willow used for ceremonial purposes. All the berry stalks and countless, countless animals, beaver, wolves, moose, deer, elk, are gone. They were lost to the flames there. In the Shuswap, which is just north of where I live, our sister community there, the Bush Creek East fire forced the evacuation of 11,000 people. That's everybody from that area. Members of the Adams Lake Indian Band lost 31 homes. And many right now are still living away from home because they don't have places to go home to, cabins and motels and wherever they can. They're unable to return home. This is all just in the last couple of years. And the fires have been growing bigger, faster, and more frequent every year. 2021, both fires and landslides and flooding severely impacted more than 100 First Nations in BC. But they've been facing flooding over many years. So this is nothing new, but this was much, much worse than anything that they had faced before. In the Fraser River, a rock slide in 2019, as well as last year, 2023, record low river water levels blocked salmon from moving upstream to their spawning grounds. The people from Lillooet were out there by hand, working day and night, and it was in the news, lifting the fish over to where they could go further on up the river. These are all effects that will be felt for many years to come for our peoples. It's not just a matter of losing a home and the belongings in the home. It's losing all of those things that I just mentioned, because they won't come back for years because those forests are gone. And it's going to get worse. So, as Grand Chief Stuart Phillip from UBCIC, he's my first cousin, by the way, has stated, the land is speaking to us. We need to listen. And as Ariel Derringer, the executive director of Indigenous Climate Action, stated, the climate crisis can't be addressed in any meaningful way without addressing its root causes: capitalism, colonialism, and extractivism. That's all going on right now and pressing forward faster than ever. The injustice I just talked about are just examples. They didn't just start when the climate crisis became noticeable to people. They've been going on for years for us. Those root causes have been going on as a colonial process. I have seen so many changes in my territory over my own lifetime, as has every person who's my age and older. Its effects on us as Indigenous peoples are now getting worse, much more rapidly than ever. There's helplessness and hopelessness in our communities. And that's something that we have to work against. Our leaders have to work against, to try to find ways to provide change and hope right in our own Indigenous community. They have severe impacts on already vulnerable people, people that have been traumatized by the unjust taking of our lands, by the residential schooling, by the public schooling, and the continual obstructing of access to our foods and our sovereignty on our lands. So in terms of looking at climate justice work, going back to Ariel's words in terms of those root causes, capitalism, colonialism, and extractivism, there's many areas of work that needs to be forwarded and done in those three areas. These are things that can be addressed by government. We know that. But how can we hold governments and corporate actors accountable, when their actions are controlled from within the comfortable and protected lives that they are expected to keep great. An example is the recent dropping of proposed amendments to the BC Land Act to bring it in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that would have allowed shared decision-making with First Nations over land use here in British Columbia. It was dropped because so much pressure was being put on this government, this NDP government. So where do you think that pressure came from? And what do you think that pressure was about? It wasn't about climate change. It wasn't about Indigenous peoples or Indigenous rights. About those three things that Ariel mentioned. Climate justice demands that frontline communities, all communities, not just Indigenous communities, but all communities, frontline communities that are most vulnerable to the effects of climate change have to be fully engaged in solutions making about mitigating those harms and about reducing those harms and about cleaning up after the effects of those harms. However difficult that shift may be in policy and action making, it is we, the people, that have to make those actions happen. Because we will be seeing more frequent climate-related disasters with its increasing social inequalities and crippling social justice related to shelter, to food, to livelihood. There will be more and more people suffering, not just Indigenous people, but my focus is on Indigenous people. We will continue to see the lives being lost by all of our living things out there, all of our living relatives. We as Syilx people, as many of the Salish people who are my relatives, all across the 25 Salish and speaking peoples that we are, including the Musqueam here, we give personhood to every living thing, not just animals, not just birds, but everything that lives. Every little flea and every little thing that lives is recognized as having its own right to live in our laws. That's how our people think when they go out there, and it's mistaken for something else. It's mistaken for religion and other things like that. Yes, we have ceremonies to make sure everybody feels that, knows that, understands that, and practices that in their everyday lives, so that all living things have the right to be and not to be extinct and extirpated and dislodged from their areas. I think about all of those and look at some of the things that people are concerned about. Of course, there are legal and political implications in change making. There always will be, but it's doable. We know that it's doable. But the biggest thing that I see related to Indigenous peoples and shaping climate solutions is this ugly beast in the room that has to be talked about. The fear of empowering Indigenous-led climate action. It's a huge barrier. You can call it whatever you want, but it's that. Fear of us maybe having a little bit of power, having a little bit of say, so that we can make changes happen. Because the solutions in reducing the harms that are being worked out, where people are forced to work with us, forced to work with Indigenous people, and have to collaborate with them. They're seeing benefits, they're seeing success, they're seeing things that work in different ways than they ever thought about. Governments and agencies of our governments can and do use their expertise to make changes happen when they are guided. And by guided, I mean guided by Indigenous people's knowledge, Indigenous structures, and Indigenous laws. In terms of working with Indigenous knowledge keepers and peoples. And when there are resources that are provided to work that way, and when there are incentives that provide ways to work that way. I think about some of the work that is going on. There are more good examples, more and more good examples, especially from these institutions of knowledgeable people, because this is where it has to start. People with knowledge, people with tools, people with resources, people that can leverage different kinds of things that can work out there in collaboration with Indigenous people. I know because I'm part of that movement, and I know it works. So there are many skills that have to be represented and included, and our community Indigenous governments have to be involved, however difficult that may seem. The shift that seems to be difficult can happen with good heart, goodwill, and understanding that we have to take a chance to do things in a different way. And we have to have the courage to do that in a different way than we have before. Solutions in sharing the burden of climate injustice effects have to find ways to be actualized and led by the people with Indigenous lands and with unceded territories here in this BC. What does unceded territory mean? If not that, there's no fear in us going and grabbing the land and doing all of the things that have been done to it. We have to think about how we can be advocates in different ways together. I feel, and I know the deep despair and the emptiness when I see beautiful places damaged and changed forever, but I also have hope. We here in these institutions can move this agenda in every possible way that we can, with providing voice as has been done today. We can actualize good research collaborations with on-the-ground field study opportunities that foster Indigenous-led climate actions right on the land. We must widen the scope of Indigenous student support in such projects because they have the gifts of knowledge from their homelands and will apply them in many good ways. And I have seen that happening. There's really good examples, large examples, like the work that we're doing in the Okanagan on putting the river back, putting the Okanagan River back because we're restoring the salmon. It's a success story. Look it up. I think about the Buffalo Treaty that Leroy Little Bear in Alberta and his colleagues are working on. That's a success story, spans borders and states and provinces. That's Indigenous led. So we can actualize these things. We have to widen our scope. We have to reach out. We have to step forward to work in good collaborative ways by advancing these theories and practices of environmental justice through engaging with Indigenous peoples and their communities on their lands, on their terms. I wish you and wish my words well in terms of moving forward on this action. Thank you for listening. Be well.
Very narrow. Kia ora. This is going, yes, it is. I can hear the double sound. Ko whakapūtaki, tōku monga. Ko wairoa, tōku awa. Ko takatimu, tōku waka. Ko Ngāti Kahanunu, tōku iwi. Ko Christine Winter, tōku ingoa. Nō rewa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tāku mihi, tēnai ki koutou nā tangata o Musqueam, nā kai puripuri, mātauranga. Katou nā kaitiaki o tēnei whenua, mai I te ata hāpara tuatahi. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. Ko tāku mihi ki te Naomi, Roa, Katie, te Centre for Climate Justice, nō rewa, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm going to talk primarily about Māori epistemologies and ontologies. And that introduction was a good starting place for you to begin to understand them. And of course you didn't understand a word I said, but that's just fine. So first thing I did was I named my ancestral mountain, Whakapunaki. Following that, I named my ancestral river, the Wairoa. These places hold our ancestors and their stories. They contain their memories and their laughter, their hopes and their dreams. They are also life-giving. Food and water and spiritual well-being come from those places. These are the places, too, that must be cared for future generations. Next, I named the ocean-going, the Pacific crossing vessel, Takitimu, that brought my first ancestors to Aotearoa during the 13th century to settle in a place that is now called Wairoa. Called Wairoa once they settled, actually. And I've established here a set of relationships stretching across time and across species boundaries so that you can know who I am and where I fit in relation. I could and should have introduced you to my direct human relationships too, past and present, and my partner and my children, but you know, time constraints. So I followed that with an acknowledgement of the Musqueam people, the knowledge holders who have been the caretakers of this land since the first dawn. And finally, a thank you to Naomi for bringing me here, Katie for all the organisation required to get me safely settled, and some acknowledgements to the Centre for Climate Justice. That's just such a cool orientation, such a grand name. I think that's fantastic. So thank you. So from this, you will be gathering, I hope, that Māori have a relational ontology, one that understands that we are in the world via a series of multi-species relationships, human to human, human to earth others. And there's no sharp distinction made at all between human and other earth others in this ontology. In fact, humans are understood to be the youngest sibling of creation, and therefore we have responsibilities to it. Our epistemology is relational too. The word for epistemology, it may appear to you that I am swearing when I give you the Māori word, and I am not. Our epistemology is whakapapa, which means literally to lay down in layers. Knowledge is laid down in a series of relational layers. To understand anything, one needs to know its relationships and where it fits in the world. I'm going to give you another example of Māori ontology before I start talking more about why I think epistemology and ontology are critical to climate justice. I'm going to talk about pronouns. So in English, we have a bunch of pronouns. I, me, she, her, him, he, or he, him, they, them, it, we, us, right? And you. So in there are two sets of relational pronouns, we, us, and they, them. Now, In Te Reo Māori, in Māori language, pronouns trace relationships in some depth. So there's me, you, him, just like in English. And then there is you and me, Jeanette, but not Naomi. And then there is you and me, Jeanette, and Naomi. And then there is you and Naomi, but not me. Then there is you and me, or both of you and me, and all the audience. Then each one of these has its own pronoun, all right? This is the point I'm making. And then there is you and Naomi and all the audience, but not me. And then there is you and me, Jeanette, and the audience, but not Naomi. And then there is the audience, but not we three. Then there are pronouns for people not included in our grouping today. So, and those random people out there. A singular pronoun, a dual pronoun, and a collective pronoun for all those randoms. Then there are, pronouns describe, or maybe prescribe and proscribe how we relate to each other. Pronouns a language or culture uses tells us the value that they place on relationality. From Te Ao Māori, from the Māori worldview, for something to exist or to be, it requires knowing to whom and what and how it is related. This, of course, is a worldview in which individualism has no place. Individuals are understood to thrive rather, not to be. Individuals are understood to thrive in the context of relationships. Good relations allow the individual to blossom, not the other way around. So that brings me to climate change. You will be saying, ugh, at last. Climate change is a symptom of bad relationships. Bad relationships between people and the planet. And those bad relationships are wreaking havoc. I'm suggesting here that climate change cannot be addressed out of an individualistic and anthropocentric epistemology. From within a language structure or a knowledge structure that isolates one aspect of knowledge from another, and human from all other earth beings, animate and inanimate. It's a structure that disciplines knowledge into geography, political science, philosophy, geology, all of them in isolated domains. I think even the noun discipline tells us so much about the violent rending of knowledge and its forceful separation and disconnection. And of course, from isolation from each other. It's this structure of knowledge making and holding, combined with reification of the place of human beings on the planet, that's brought us into this pickle called climate change, to a point of chaos and roiling crisis that David Schlossberg, who's here in the audience, refers to as turbulence. So last August, I was here in Vancouver. My daughter was defending her PhD here. So in September or August last year, your skies were thick with the forest smoke and ash that Jeanette was talking about. All those dead trees, creatures and critters, and the burnt soil hung in a leaden sky. I looked across the smoky harbour and I was struck by the irony of the oil tankers lining up to load up. And then by a passing bus that had emblazoned on its side, the world is asking for energy. BC LNG will reduce global emissions. Really? Those few moments, and they occurred in close succession, those few minutes spoke of an individualist, anthropocentric epistemology and denial of reality. So returning to the title of this event, it is at the level of epistemology and ontology that I think Indigenous knowledge can shine. Am I going for time? Okay. So when a Maori person meets someone unknown, the question we ask is, ko wai ingoa? So that's what is your name? But the why means water. So in a sense, it's asking, what water are you? In other words, tell me where you fit, where you are from, who do you count as your relations? Let me get a picture of you embodied in a bunch of multi-species relationships, for only then can I begin to know you. It's not a question of where you went to school or what job you have or how much money you've managed to accumulate. It's a question that says, how do you relate to other people and the earth? I'm suggesting that climate injustice stems from bad relationships, nation to nation, person to person to other earth beings. And a solution, I'm suggesting, cannot be found within a knowledge system that is founded on an individualistic and anthropocentric ontology. Or put otherwise, a solution is unlikely to arise from within the same mindset that is at its foundation. I'm suggesting that there is a causal link between knowledge structures and views of what it is to be in the world that has created this mess called climate change. In its place, I suggest that to understand anything, climate injustice included, we need to know its relationship and where it fits into the world. And then we can start setting those relationships right. E whakatomuri te haere whakamoa. I walk backwards into the future, looking at the past. Now, perhaps more than ever, it's time to learn from past triumphs and mistakes and to craft a vibrant future. Tēnā koe. Thank you very much for inviting me to be with you today.
Thank you both for those wonderfully provocative and challenging presentations. It fills me with resolve to hear you both speak. I think we should go into the discussion a little bit to make sure we have time. Unless there's something on your mind, Jeanette, that you okay. All right. Hey. I want to start with I mentioned in my introduction that some of your recent writing has been on land back, and I know that this question is very entangled and enmeshed in all of your work, Dr. Armstrong. So let's start with that. Let's start with how are we thinking about this that maybe is a little bit twisted? How does it relate to this pushback that we just heard about that's happening here in BC? I was so struck in one of your recent pieces of writing that the Maori word for land is the same as the word for placenta. And so with that, I would just ask you to maybe unpack that a little bit for us. And maybe speak a little bit about how decolonization is connected to decommodification in this worldview. I'll give you both a chance to speak to this.
Well, you start with the easy questions, don't you? So we'll start with the word whenua, which means land, and it means placenta. So I think, again, that tells you a lot about a Maori worldview. As the placenta has nurtured the infant, so too the land nurtures us and protects us and provides for us. So it's about acknowledging the gifts that the world, whenua, the land, give. And of course, coming with a gift comes a sense of responsibility. So the relationship to the land is a relationship of responsibility. It's not a relationship of ownership. And in the piece that Naomi just alluded to, which isn't published yet, because it's part of something much bigger and we're not quite sure how to get it published, I'm arguing that what land back is about is actually about, it's about good relationships. It's about dismantling a system of bad relationships where property can be dominated, where property can be destroyed, where property can be sort of just marked off on a map without thinking about all the flows through that land and all the relationships embedded in it. So for me, land back, it doesn't mean, you know, all of you settlers beetle off back to where you came from. That's a ridiculous notion. But it does mean that the land will be restored to a place of good relations. It means if you have a right to build a house on a plot of land, and I don't think that anybody is trying to suggest that we shouldn't be able to have our homes and have an area that we feel comfortable in, that nurtures us, that cares for us. But it will require you establishing good relations with that land, good relations with all the non-human realm that lives with you on that land. There was another part to that question. Was there?
No,
Okay.
I think that was it. Thank you. Yeah. Jeanette? Fit with the work of priority places. Territory.
I just wanted to, first of all, really thank you for bringing that concept of making relationships with the land. It's really critical to what I was talking about earlier and foundational to Indigenous people. The idea of that relationship is so much different than commodities, like you said, modification, or which is part of the whole misuse and damage of a lot of places and a lot of living things. Our word for all of those living things, every one of those living things that I was mentioning that we recognize as persons, in our pronouns, we refer to them as people. When we talk to them, when we go out there to connect with them and relate to them, that's part of what people see, or anthropologists see as some kind of something else. I don't even want to mention what what they think it is, but it's really that human to other life form connection in a very different way than academically. I think that relationship has to be returned. One of my mentors, John Mohawk, he was from the Seneca, he talked about re-indigenizing the planet, that everyone must find a way to indigenize themselves in that way to all the living things around them. And then they can't help but change their economics and their government systems and so on. And I think we're on the very edge of that, because it is happening with people. So I think in the work that Anauken is doing in relationship with UBC Okanagan and some of the clusters, research clusters that I'm involved in and have been involved in, that support the land back work that way. And of course, when you say land back, it sounds ominous and political and scary and puts the fear into people. And of course, that's what others use to fuel the resistance to it. And so we have to stop that. we have to find ways to quiet that voice down and say what is truthful. There's a lot of really important work being done. There's some good programs that Canada is putting forward, like the Priority Places program, and take advantage of that and work with others to collaborate with Indigenous, non-Indigenous people, make good relationships on the land and restore the land in all the ways that it needs to be restored. Some of the work that I do in Okanagan is related to that. Even re-looking at what grows on our campuses. You can't just re-indigenize the classroom or the curriculum. Look outside. There's living things out there, you know. And our birds, our butterflies are disappearing. Our bees are disappearing. You know, all of these things that matter are disappearing. All the resources that are spent, and those are lovely, and there's places for them. But there's places for those other beautiful things that are indigenous to our lands as well, that does multiple things. So there's that kind of land back we're talking about. It's not just that political thing about ownership and property and taxes and so on. Thanks.
Pink puffy flower shamed here. But there are other plants. So you've already started to speak to this, Jeanette, about the possibilities for the university to be a constructive partner and a transformational partner, but also we know that it is also the university is also a site of harm, not just historically, but in an ongoing way. I was struck, Christine, when you were describing that way of introducing, you know, by mountain, by water, that, you know, I may have imagined it, but I saw a few sort of looks of panic cross people's eyes, like, do I know what water I'm from? And so I'm wondering, you both work with students, you know, how to balance that desire that I think exists in our student population at the undergraduate and graduate student level to connect, to be of service. But there's also a danger of appropriating identity. And so what are the principles of the right kind of scholarship and right relationship? You talked about a few examples, but what are the underlying principles that we can carry to different projects? Anybody want to start?
Well, I can give a couple of examples. When the Okanagan Nation, for example, decided that one of the chiefs, who is also my cousin, Albert Saddleman, he said they were talking about the decline of the sockeye in the Okanagan River system because of the 14 dams across the border and one dam on this side of the border. And so the chiefs were talking about it, and they were really concerned about it. And Albert, he's passed away now. He got up and he said, well, we have to put them back. We have to figure out what we need to do, who we need to be friends with, and how we need to do things. And it's not going to be our communities that can do that. There's a lot of power out there. And so that was one of the things I think that really helped, is in that process of looking at how do you bring people to the way we think about it. We went to talk to two of the old people, knowledge keepers, and asked them, how do we do that? He said, well, do it the way we do it. You know, call up your enemies and tell them, come, we're going to feed you. We're going to have a feast, you know, and we want you to, we want you to sit with us, and we want to tell you, you know, what's happening and what can you do? How can you help us? You know, you're in places of power. So Department of Fisheries and Oceans, the Public Utilities District of the Grand Coulee Dam, they were all invited by the chiefs right by the river outside. And our chief said, let's do the water ceremonies and invite them to participate and help them to feel what we feel about the river and the salmon. That was over 25 years ago, and some of the biggest runs of sockeye salmon are now back in our river. Because you can do that. You can make that happen. It's hard, but it's doable.
Incredible. Thank you. Christine, I was so struck by your description, you know, when you come into a city with outsider eyes and that description of the smoke and the tankers and the buses. It made me want to say, you know, one of the things we hear at UBC is that we're inspired by our surroundings. A lot of people come here to do work related to the quote unquote environment. Because it's a beautiful place, but it's a reminder to not only be inspired by the pretty parts, but also the ugly parts, right? What are some projects you've been involved in that carry good relationships, or some principles?
I find this really difficult. Talk
about.
No. Well, yes, but no. I don't know if you say yeah, nah here, but we say yeah, nah in Australia and New Zealand, which kind of encapsulates that response from me, yeah, nah. Actually, one thing that has stayed in my mind, or however many years it is since you were in Sydney getting the Sydney Peace Prize, you did an event, I think, at in Angel Place, and there was a young Aboriginal woman there, a woman called Murawa Johnson, who's done some extraordinary things to subvert an Indian company that wants to mine coal on her traditional lands. And she had two pieces of advice. One particularly was given to an old white man who put his hand up and said, "What can I do?" And she had, you remember this? And Murawa just said, she said two things that were just so powerful. The first was, listen. And the second was, be prepared to be led. I think that says it all.
Yeah. Learn to follow. Yeah. Yes, I'd totally forgotten about that. It's been years. Yeah, thank you for that. So I want to pick up on, you quoted Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, another cousin, about that the land is speaking to us, and this is also a thread, I think, in both of your work, that this could be a catalyst, this moment of crisis, where it's impossible to deny that this way of thinking is failing us on so many different levels. So does that feel possible, that this could be, I once heard Leanne Simpson talk about it, that this could be a moment of punctuated transformation, in the same way that we're seeing these punctuated crises?
If you'd asked me that question 2 years ago, I would have said yes. Even a year ago, I would have said yes. And I've witnessed two things that have occurred down under in the Deep South. The first is an orchestrated campaign to deny Australia's Aboriginal people a voice to Parliament, which was engineered from the United States by a think tank that just completely undermined any opportunity for the Aboriginal people to have a voice. They're only 3% of the population. So, you know, go out and vote is not going to do them any good. So in April of last year, something like 78% of Australia's people were going to vote yes. By the vote, by the time it came to voting, they voted it down. And it was because of a very, very clever no campaign. And the second reason why I'm not hopeful is that a Conservative government has just been elected in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And they have literally ripped up, well, not literally, figuratively, ripped up any legislation that gave any sort of power to Māori and or the environment. And simultaneously, a young man who was, anybody under 50 incidentally is young, a young man who was trained by that same institute is in a powerful position in Parliament and is calling for a revision of our foundation treaty. That those two events have occurred fill me with distress. What fills me with hope and the thought that we may be on edge of a change are the young people I teach, young people who get it, basically. They are the up and coming voters. They are the ones who I hope will be able to forge the change that unfortunately we have not been able to forge. So I am skeptical and I am hopeful.
Well, I have to agree with you. And so the idea, I think, of what's going on, not just in the kinds of things you described happening in other countries, what's going on in North America and South America and here in Canada, here in British Columbia, with this amendment that I was talking about just failing after so much hope and work on it. One of the things that I think back to in a philosophy course that I was in, instructor was talking about all of these swings from, you know, left liberal thinking all the way to the right, and the length of time that it takes to build up and what it takes when that happens. And then when you hit the worst, and then it starts swinging back, at what level the like the gross number of peoples that have had enough. We're almost there. And that part, I think, is really an important thing to pay attention to. It is a lot of the young people, the young scholars especially, are moving toward understanding that enough, and that will make the difference. It won't be our generation, but those of us that are there that can stand with the young people as long as we're standing will be there. And I think that gives me hope. That gives me a way to be able to continue doing this. Otherwise, it's hard. It's very hard. After these last 5 years, it's just about things that are gone on the land. Young people give me hope. People like Don Morrison over there give me hope, you know, and the work that they're doing, and other people, Indigenous leaders that are not afraid, that get dragged off to jail, that get dragged off, and their younger ones are standing in their stead. All of those people matter. I think talks like this, where we're just straightforward about it, you know, they matter, and they I think give courage, because we are going to be facing worse in a bit here. U.S. is at that, almost at that part where there's going to be some bad things happening. That might will follow here like it is in other countries, in countries that you were talking about. So that relationship building with everyone is important, I think, and that gives me hope.
Thank you both so much. We have some time for questions, so let's open it up. Don't be shy, or I'll put Dawn on the spot. Student? Yes. Anyone?
My question would be for both of you, but certainly for Jeanette. You gave some good examples of making change with buffalo, with salmon in there, and certainly there's lots of other examples with caribou I think of. But my question is about scale. If the challenges are so great and the structures are so embedded, so rooted. Yeah, I think of the forests. What is your thinking about that?
I know, and it's that part that's maybe really emotional for me to try to think about. I think every piece, with every single small project to the bigger projects, have to ramp up. But some of those lands are not going to recover for many years without like miracles of resources and people. So can we make that happen? You know, I think that's on everyone. I think that work, I'm not sure it can happen, right? In the way things are moving, what Christine just, that's what's, you know, but I think what's powerful is that we can name those things, we can ask those questions. And just in asking makes it clear that we have to make do with what we can, right? We have to, there's just no.
Dr. Armstrong, you talked about we need to leverage our resources, and I was wondering if there was any specific places in your mind from your experience where maybe certain ministries within the provincial government or federal government or at a local government scale where you see the most optimism for leveraging relationships to make the most impact.
On that one, because there are there is quite a bit of works. How long that'll be in terms of how long this government is in place here in BC and in Canada. There are some good Climate Change Canada projects that are leveraging and resources and expertise. Works with Indigenous people like the Indigenous Protected Areas Initiative and the Priority Places Initiative, which isn't just Indigenous, but a sector of it is toward Indigenous people. I know the province in in their climate action portfolio is doing that work. But I think of the non-governmental organizations that are really stepping up. They really are a lot of people who are doing volunteerism. And I think about, I've spoken about this before here at Green College, that I think if you can make it, instead of volunteerism, if you can put ordinary people who don't have jobs, give them incentives to do that work. Places, whether it's along a creek side or whether it's in a boulevard or wherever, that kind of thinking at the much needed level of where people have needs, right? Other way that that can be moved. So it might be in those areas where we're looking at poverty or we're looking at homelessness, different ways that people can be brought back to health and wellness, and those are areas that our nation as Seal people are looking, not just looking at it compartmentalized here and there and there and there, but try to find different ways to break open those compartmentalizations so that it can be fulfilled, that people are yearning for, want to be out there, whatever small level that they can.
And a few more questions. Yeah, Don.
White Hoharab, especially Jeanette, good to see you again, and Naomi, and really nice to hear the words from Christine from Maryland. And as a member of the Secwepemc Nation and founder and curator of the Working Group on Indigenous Food Sovereignty, Jeanette's helped us ignite this beautiful movement here that is helping not only us as Indigenous peoples and a lot of our settler friends and allies to realize ourselves as a part of the land through the food that we eat. And so there's a lot of really good movement happening, and we see a lot of what you're talking about with like the need to leverage more support, both financial, technical, and human support. And when we think about, as Indigenous peoples, the structural racism and all of the challenges that have disconnected us from the land, and thinking about like the system of apartheid in South Africa, where I've gone numerous times to learn and do exchange on how they're mobilizing, and knowing how important universities were in the global campaign that led to the formation of a new constitution for South Africa, the end of apartheid. I guess I'm just curious as to know what your thoughts would be around mobilizing in universities in a similar way. I think a lot of it comes down to communications and media support, because I think on the ground and running these kind of projects and mobilizing people, that seems to be a big challenge for us, and coordinating efforts and thinking about how we could leverage support, institutional support from universities. I'm curious to know. I think that's probably a really broad question for students too, but I think that's where we're at with the work that we're doing on food sovereignty, and knowing that this big techno-bureaucratic places are pretty, have a lot of potential support there. So, and knowing how big the mainstream media is, that, I mean, the counter narrative to what we're trying to do, I think it's of value to kind of go into that conversation around communications and support, human support within the student body as well. But thank you.
Yeah, Don. Let's get we've got a question in the back, so let's just, we're a little low on time, so maybe we, yeah, you're gonna have to answer.
begin an answer to you. It's not a full answer. It's not a well-resolved answer. I think what you're asking is enormous. One of the things we have at my university, the University of Otago, is an organised volunteering for students. So there is, for the moment, for the life of me, I can't remember what they've called it. But students volunteer and they get a certificate and they get able to put on their CV that they have done this volunteering work, so that the groups in the community let the university know that they've got capacity for volunteers, and the students line up to do it. And it seems to be a really, really positive campaign. And I did have a second thought, but it's just gone.
This isn't really a question, it's more of a request. And it's more of a relational request for us all in this room to just take a moment to sort of breathe in the collective grief that we're all feeling at this moment, because it is real and it's heavy. And to also, at the same time, lift us all up, because I think the important thing to remember is that part of the campaigns that are out there are to deflate us, are to bring us down, are to make us feel hopeless. And so my prayers are here to just, they let us realize the collective strength and realize that we can not only have land back in a way that is in relationship, but we can also take back a system that was stolen.
Thank you for naming that. Thank you both for honesty and vulnerability. And one of the things I feel I've learned from this really remarkable dialogue, which is beyond what one never knows what happens when we bring amazing people together, and it was just really beautiful. I'm really going to carry it with me, the way your ideas intersected. And one of the things that I think is really clear is that if we take this shift in worldview, this challenge, to take seriously what it means to treat the non-human world as person, as living, there's grief there, because it means that then the losses, we're not protected from the losses if we truly believe in the integrity and personhood of the non-human world. And I feel like that is what I'm going to be taking away most. And that grief is also a gift, because it means it's the flip side of love, as anybody who has tangled with grief knows. And I think that's probably. And I also do want to say, a little theory I have is that part of what is happening with the lull in the climate movement, and we have to be honest that we are in a lull, that it isn't the moment where there's hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, as was the case in 2019, or millions around the world. There's also a teaching there, right? Because those were calls for action, those were calls for declare a climate emergency. And it's not to denigrate that, but it wasn't the deeper shift that we're talking about today, that we've been hearing about, is needed. And so that doesn't mean that the movement is dead. It means, it could mean that we are in a regrouping and a deepening. And I also just want to say that movement is not dead, that we have seen a huge surge in primarily youth-led organizing against genocide in these streets and streets around the world, that make the connection between the genocide in Palestine and the genocide in Canada and the Indigenous people around the world. And that there is huge grief in witnessing a live stream genocide. And there is also going to be transformation that comes out of all of this trauma, and we don't know what it's going to look like. But I don't believe we are in a moment where we are unresponsive. I think unshocked, regrouping, hurting, but changing and deepening, I hope. So thank you so much. It's really been such an honor to share this space with you. And thank you to everybody who made this event possible. Thank you all for coming. And I give you permission to enjoy the pink fluffy flowers.